Donald Trump says US relations with Russia are at an all-time low. How much further will the diplomatic feud go, and what's at stake? I'm Shuli Ghosh, and today's newsmakers are the US and Russia. It's dysfunctional but indispensable, and the rocky relationship between Russia and the US has taken another hit. Last week, President Donald Trump signed a bill into law that strengthens sanctions against Russia. For a president accused of being too cozy with the Kremlin, it offered an opportunity to temper people's criticism. Instead, Trump attacked Congress over the bill and in the process alienated fellow Republicans. Russia swiftly responded by ordering more than 700 US diplomatic staff to leave. Now it's Trump's turn again, with his administration expected to respond by the end of the month. But there's the dilemma. Will Trump retaliate and risk further escalation, or face a political backlash at home by letting it slide? Sandra Gatman has more.
Ever since US President Donald Trump took office, one word in particular has been echoing around Capitol Hill.
Russia.
Allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election have consumed American politics. Several investigations are underway, looking into the Kremlin's actions and whether Trump's campaign accepted outside help. Relations between Washington and Moscow were already frosty under former US President Barack Obama. The US and EU have repeatedly imposed sanctions against Russia over the conflict in Ukraine. Now, President Trump has signed off on even more sanctions, this time over reported Russian meddling in the last elections. Moscow retaliated, ordering 755 US diplomats to leave the country. Despite the standoff, US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson met Sergei Lavrov on the sidelines of the recent ASEAN summit. There were signs both countries may be prepared to patch things up.
So I don't think it is useful to just cut everything off over one single issue. I think, again, these are two very large countries, and we should find the places that we can work together. Let's try to work together.
Но мы почувствовали готовность наших американских коллег все-таки диалог продолжать. Думаю, что альтернативы этому просто не существует.
The escalating tension with Russia has put Trump in a corner. He's hinted at wanting to improve relations with President Vladimir Putin, who he openly admires.
Yeah, I think we got along very well, and I think that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing.
But can the US and Russia ultimately overcome their differences on major global issues, which have sunk relations to their lowest point since the Cold War? Fighting in Ukraine between government forces and pro-Russian separatists hasn't stopped. And the US and Russia accuse each other of providing military support to opposing forces on the ground. A total breakdown in bilateral relations would sink an already fragile peace deal there. Over in Syria, Washington and Moscow are also at odds over Russia's military backing of Bashar al-Assad. International efforts to stop the war have so far failed. But the two have recently brokered a ceasefire in southwestern Syria.
When two superpowers, Russian Federation, which is an ally of President Assad, and the United States of America, agree fundamentally at that level in trying to make that ceasefire work, there is a strong chance that that will take place.
The trouble is, Trump is new in office, while Putin has an election to win next year. That means both men need to make an impression, and they may well return to strong rhetoric and political posturing. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington is Jamie Fly. He's a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, as well as a former security advisor to Senator Marco Rubio. In Pittsburgh, we have human rights professor Dan Kovalik. He's the author of The Plot to Scapegoat Russia, How the CIA and the Deep State Have Conspired to Vilify Russia. And in Vienna, Emre Erşin, he's a Russia analyst at Turkey's Marmara University. Gentlemen, good to have you with us. So here's the thing. Trump has been promising closer ties with Russia, with President Putin. Now he's been backed into signing these sanctions, which he or any future president is going to find hard to ignore. Jamie, have US-Russia relations evaporated before our very eyes?
I don't think that there's all that much change, actually. I think for the last several presidential administrations, we've had contentious relations between the United States and Russia. Multiple administrations have tried to improve those relations, to find areas where they can work with the Russian government. But the reality is that Russia continues to pursue policies that run counter to U.S. interests, that threaten our allies. And so I think certainly there's a broad support in the U.S. public and in the U.S. Congress for these sanctions, and I think the Trump administration is going to have its hands tied to a certain extent and be somewhat limited in what they can do. But
it isn't the issue with President Trump that he talked about, personality politics. President Putin is a good guy, someone he can work with. I mean, that's what people were worried about.
Well, he has talked about trying to improve relations with Vladimir Putin. They supposedly got on well together in their first meeting, but the reality is previous presidents have had the same sort of interaction with Russian leaders, and there haven't been positive results. And so I think that's the challenge that President Trump now faces.
Emre, why tie Trump's hands over sanctions? Is this him being sidelined?
Well, I think he's sidelined by the American establishment, and I think this is how Russia perceives the situation. Because when President Trump was elected, they really had high expectations about the future of Russian-American relations, which were at an all-time low during the last few years of the Obama period. So, and we know, for example, that Trump, through his social media account, claimed that he was not very happy about what's going on regarding the relations with Russia. So it seems that it takes more than Trump to fix the relationship between Russia and the United States. And I think this is also why Russia actually decided to go back to its harsh rhetoric about the United States administration and its foreign policy very lately.
Dan, do you agree with that? Did President Putin believe when Trump came to power that there would be a thaw in relations?
Well, I think so, because as you indicated, Trump made noises that he wanted friendlier relations with Russia. And I don't see why we can't have those relations. I really disagree with Jamie's assessment that other presidents have tried to have good relations with Russia. In fact, I think they haven't. I think Russia has tried to have good relations with us. Putin was the first world leader to call George W. Bush after 9/11 to offer condolences, to offer help in Afghanistan with operations there after 9/11. He gave that help. He helped Obama with the Iran nuclear deal. He helped rid Syria of chemical weapons. I don't see Russia as a threat to the United States or its interests. I don't think the U.S. has tried to accept the olive branch that Russia has offered. And I do think that Trump has now been painted into a corner, mostly by the Democrats over this Russiagate nonsense, which seems to have little validity there. So yes, I think
nonsense. Are you talking about the accusations that Russia meddled in the election? Because obviously that's an accusation that's been taken pretty seriously in Washington.
Yes, and I don't think it is serious. I agree with John Pilger, one of my favorite journalists, who says there's not even any allegations there. It's just a big smokescreen, I think, to cover the Democrats' butts after losing the election to Trump. And by the way, I'm not a Trump supporter, but I do support the attempt to have détente with Russia. And I think all of this Russiagate is just a distraction from huge issues confronting the United States.
Let's see what Jamie says about that. This idea that, that this accusations of Russia meddling in the election, this is all just a distraction and a way of torpedoing, better relations between the US and Russia.
Well, Well, the reality, if you look at the last sanctions bill that was passed overwhelmingly in Congress, and it wasn't just passed with Democratic votes, it was passed because Republicans both wrote the original legislation and then endorsed it in both houses. I mean, Republicans control both houses of Congress, so they backed this measure. It wasn't just in response to Russia's meddling in our elections and our politics. It was also in response to Russia's ongoing aggression in Ukraine, its meddling in Syria, and a whole host of issues, its ongoing threats to our allies in Europe. And so, you know, I know some people don't like to believe that Russia has now taken this to the next level and actually trying to insert itself into our politics. But it's a fundamental fact, and it's a reality because of our failed efforts over the last several administrations to try to find these areas of cooperation. At every turn, Putin has ended up exploiting American presidents, and that's the real danger that I think President Trump faces if he continues to deny reality and tries to go back again and again to find these areas of cooperation. Vladimir Putin is not interested in cooperating with the United States.
Okay, let's just remind ourselves of the optimism of just a few weeks ago when President Trump met President Putin at the G20 conference. This is what he had to say.
President Putin and I have been discussing various things, and I think it's going very well. We've had some very, very good talks. We're going to have a talk now, and obviously that will continue. But we look forward to a lot of very positive things happening for Russia, for the United States, and for everybody concerned.
Emre, are there still areas where Russia and the US can still cooperate, even with these sanctions hanging over Russia?
Well, I think we need to be optimistic about the United States-Russian relations because we are actually talking about two permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So in terms of international law, any kind of resolution would need both of their approval. So I think they're aware of that. And despite all the disagreements in many issues, including Syria, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and etc., they still need each other very desperately in all of these issues at the same time. For example, you just mentioned the meeting between Trump and Putin. One of the things they agreed in that meeting was about the establishment of a de-escalation zone in southwest of Syria. So currently the situation in Syria is very complicated, and both actors are very crucial actors in terms of finding a solution to Syria. And I also believe that is the case for Ukraine. Yes, I know that the sanctions are about Ukraine and Crimea, but I think the United States should also be wise to know that without reaching out to Russia, there is no way to correct the situation in Ukraine, or at least take some meaningful steps regarding Crimea. So in all these geopolitical issues that we're talking about, the United States and Russia needs to have a dialogue at least. I don't know if cooperation, intense cooperation, is possible, but at least a minimum level of dialogue is quite important for solving all these different issues that we talked about.
Dan, do you agree with that? Because clearly Russia is having increasing leverage, certainly in the Middle East, in the areas of Syria, some growing influence over Iraq. Do you think it's going to leave the door open to some kind of dialogue over those issues where maybe the interests of the US and Russia overlap?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think Russia's made it clear over and over that it wants to be a partner of the United States. If you watch the Oliver Stone interview with Putin, he continues to call the United States a partner. I don't think Russia wants an adversarial relationship with the United States. I think the door is open with Russia. And as was indicated, we need Russia as an ally on a number of fronts, and we certainly cannot afford to have Russia, another nuclear power, as an enemy. I think we are
given
moving
that
quite dangerous to...
President Putin's priority, one presumes, when President Trump was elected, was possibly the hope that the sanctions which had been applied from 2014 over Crimea would be relaxed. Instead, he's got a whole new raft of sanctions. So doesn't that, if that's his priority, to try and get rid of sanctions, then that's not going to work for Mr. Putin anymore, is it?
Well, it's true, and I'm certain he wants to get rid of the sanctions, but I don't think that's the only reason he wants a partnership with the United States. Look, Russia's economy is much smaller than the United States. It is a weaker power, certainly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think Russia needs the United States more than the U.S. needs Russia, and I think, you know, the U.S. has shown that sort of contempt for Russia. I think Russia wants to be part of the West. I think they thought they were going to be admitted to the West after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And frankly, I see the West, I blame the West for failing to admit them, you know, into the community of nations. We now surrounded them with NATO. And, but I think the Russians still want a partnership with the United States, and I think we should accept that.
Okay, Jamie, how much hinges on what the Trump administration will do next in regards to Russia retaliating to sanctions by kicking out hundreds of US diplomatic staff? What do you think the US's next step is going to be?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think the Trump administration has tried to play down this particular spat over diplomatic personnel, so they may feel forced to respond in some way. I don't know at the end of the day that back and forth on diplomatic personnel is really going to have a lasting impact on where U.S.-Russian relations go from here. I think the fact of the matter is the sanctions are now law. The administration is going to have to implement them. There's still a lot of bipartisan concern in Congress about the direction of U.S.-Russia policy. And the fact of the matter is, as the U.S. intelligence community has warned, the Russians are going to attempt to meddle in our politics again in the future. And so I think the bigger question is what does Congress do? What does the administration do to send a clear signal
and where is all this leading? Because there are some observers talking about a return to sort of the echoes of the Cold War.
I mean, I think it's a fundamentally different geostrategic situation compared to the Cold War. I think Russia can certainly threaten U.S. interests, but it's doing so in a very selected and targeted way. You don't have the same sort of situation where there's a balance of power on either side and countries aligned with either power. So I think I'm not worried about a new Cold War, but the reality is Vladimir Putin only understands negotiating partners that deal with him from a position of strength. And I think the lesson of the last two administrations is that when you don't deal with him from a position of strength, you end up getting your interest attacked, and eventually he attempts to meddle in your own politics.
Emre, is there...
I just think that's...
Sorry, go on, Dan.
I just think what Jamie's saying is completely made up. I mean, it's not true. As I said, Putin showed in many respects a willingness to work with the U.S. in various areas. You know, last September, he and Obama came to an agreement in Syria, which in that agreement was broken not by Putin. It was broken when the U.S. military bombed Syrian troops outside Damascus, which clearly scuttled that peace agreement. I mean, I don't see Russia as this great bugaboo that you can't work with. You can work with them, and they have worked with us. This idea that somehow it's the U.S. that has tried to work with Russia and that Russia hasn't worked with us, it's just complete nonsense. And frankly, what's happening in the Ukraine cannot be laid all at Putin's feet. The U.S. has been meddling in the Ukraine for years. The U.S. helped bring about the coup in 2014. The U.S. has been working with neo-Nazis in the Ukraine. I just think people have to get real about the U.S.'s own role vis-a-vis Russia.
So, Jamie, it's not about Russia not wanting to work with the U.S., it's the U.S. not wanting to work with Russia.
Well, the facts are that the Bush administration tried to finalize arms control agreements with Vladimir Putin's government. What they got at the end of the Bush administration was Russian invasion of Georgia. The Obama administration did the infamous reset with Russia. We were told there was a new type of Russian leader, Medvedev. He's now been once again relegated to a lower role. Putin is back. And the Obama administration ended up with Ukraine getting invaded, Russia reasserting itself in Syria in a new way. I mean, all you have to do is ask any of your viewers in Turkey, is Syria more stable now that Russia has been meddling in it for the last several years?
Well,
or was
to be
it
fair,
more stable prior to Russia getting involved?
Russia did manage to broker de-escalation zones in Syria, which is more than the US ever did.
The U.S. was involved in all of those. The UN was involved. We have new de-escalation zones. They don't end up holding The reality is Russia is emboldening Assad. They're enabling the slaughter of the Syrian people. They're empowering Iran. That's not a more stable Syria in the long run for the region and all of Syria's neighbors. That's not a Syria in the long run that's in the U.S. interest.
Okay, Emre, let me bring you into this because I said earlier, you know, are we seeing an echo of the Cold War? And nobody wants to over-egg that pudding, but we are seeing U.S. forces taking part in exercises recently across Eastern Europe, Russia building forces against its border with Europe. So, you know, where is all this leading?
Well, I mean, it might be a little misleading to call it a Cold War because I agree with the other speaker that the balance of power between the United States and Russia is not like the Cold War anymore. I mean, Russia has significant economic problems, we know that, and militarily speaking even, Russia is not able to compete with the United States or even China. So I think what Russia is trying to do is to use its strengths and especially its political influence in most of these regions that we talked about, East Europe and Middle East especially. And these are, especially when we speak about the Middle East, this is a region where the United States deliberately wanted to withdraw its forces away from during the Obama period. So whenever the United States is absent from a region, Russia uses its political influence and military influence, of course, in those regions in order to counter the United States power there. But this is not a Cold War, actually. And I would also like to say that Putin knows that he needs the United States. Yes, there are many disagreements, but on the other hand, we also talked about the areas of cooperation and other areas of geopolitical interests common to both of the countries, especially with Syria. And so I think it might be a little unfair to call it a Cold War. And we are actually beyond the Cold War. And I think this would be the way we should all be thinking in order to prevent another direct clash between Russia and the United States. Nobody would want that, including Turkey, of course. Okay, and Dan, quick last word to you. Where do you think Moscow is now looking to try, and I mean, will it try and keep relations, channels of cooperation open with the US? What's going to happen next?
I do believe they will. I think they will still want to work with the United States in Syria. We'll try to work with the U.S. for some resolution of the conflict in Ukraine. I think, you know, there is still hope for good relations, but I do agree that these sanctions have made it much more difficult, and I do worry that, in fact, we may be in the middle of a Cold War at this point, which I think none of us should welcome.
Okay, well, gentlemen, a great discussion. I think we're all agreed that it would be better if US and Russia could work together in future. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. Jamie Fly, Dan Kovalik and Emre Erşin. Still ahead, Malaysian police swoop down on hundreds of suspects looking for Daesh. Is it a crucial counter-terror operation or a well-timed political strategy? And caught in the grip of a deadly drug crisis, opioid overdoses are killing more Americans than guns and car crashes combined. What's being done about it? Welcome back to the Newsmakers. Malaysia has ramped up its counter-terrorism efforts, with police detaining hundreds of people in raids this week. But some Malaysians are questioning how successful they've been. Most of those detained were undocumented migrants, not the foreign terrorists that security forces said they were targeting. The Southeast Asian Games kick off in Kuala Lumpur next Saturday, and the country will also be holding an election within the next year. So, are these operations a necessary response to an urgent threat, or a show of force to consolidate power and popularity? Yvette McCullough takes a look.
Hunting suspected members of Daesh in a major counter-terror operation in Malaysia's capital. More than 400 people were detained during a series of raids in Kuala Lumpur. It's all part of security operations as Malaysia prepares to host the Southeast Asian Games next week.
Our operations are focused on finding and taking action against foreigners with connections to terrorism, especially those linked to activities in Syria. We are worried about these Syria-linked elements being in Malaysia.
But most of the people detained were undocumented migrants coming from Bangladesh, India, Nepal and Myanmar. The authorities say they did manage to uncover a fake passport syndicate. But the 6-hour security operation failed to turn up what authorities were looking for. They were trying to track down 16 suspects recently deported to Malaysia from Turkey after they were caught trying to cross the Turkish border to enter Syria and join Daesh. Malaysia has complained these suspects, all foreigners, were sent to Kuala Lumpur without warning. With them still at large, security forces say they cannot risk being complacent. Malaysia suffered its first Daesh attack in June 2016. Several people were injured by a grenade thrown in a nightclub in Kuala Lumpur. Malaysia's Prime Minister says security forces have prevented other terrorist plots since. As Daesh loses its footholds in Syria and Iraq, there's concern it will turn its attentions southeast and look to set up new bases. It's a rising threat that the Defence Minister has labelled Malaysia's #1 enemy.
If the offensive in Mosul, Raqqa is successful, then we will be seeing a lot of returnees, hardcore and battle-hardened IS and Daesh sympathizers coming back to our region.
There's also concern Malaysia could see scenes like its neighbour, the Philippines. Security forces there have been locked in a months-long siege after Daesh members captured the city of Marawi. But the opposition has accused the government of politicising the threat of Daesh as a general election approaches. De facto opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim says anti-terror laws are being used as a tool to stifle dissent. 5 years ago, Malaysia introduced the Security Offences Special Measures Act, and since then, 979 suspects have been arrested. The opposition says only 177 of those have been on Daesh-related charges. Is Malaysia's government using the threat of terrorism for its political advantage? Or are raids like this necessary to protect against a very real and imminent threat? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Kuala Lumpur is Zurairi R. He's a news editor and columnist for Malay Mail Online. Also from the capital, Azman bin Ujang. He's the former head of the Malaysian national news agency, Bernama. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining me. So let's talk about these raids, which police say was a counter-terrorist operation. Zurairi, 400 people arrested. What's the story? Was there a security threat uncovered?
Okay, well, you have to understand that there are basically three things going on coincidentally around this time. So we have one, it is the crackdown on unregistered foreign immigrant workers starting from around July. And the second one is sort of like a cleanup of the capital city, Kuala Lumpur, prior to the SEA Games later this month. And of course, the third one is you have the police being very concerned about the missing whereabouts of at least 16 suspected terrorists who were deported just from Turkey recently. So to be correct here, it's not exactly a crackdown on terrorists per se. It just so happens that one of the objectives is to root out these suspects.
Azman, the government says it was acting on security concerns because, of course, the Southeast Asian Games are coming up. But in this case, was this more about rounding up illegal immigrants, and was the government trying to paint it as some kind of massive security exercise?
Zurairi is correct, the combination of the three, but I think it's more to do with making sure the games, the South Asian Games, will be organized safely. And basically, it's Malaysia's way of nipping in the bud a threat posed by international terror groups, if you like. So we have been quite effective in that due to maybe quite superb intelligence that we have in this country.
Yeah, Malaysia does have legitimate security concerns, doesn't it, about the spread of Daesh or Islamic State, because they've been very active in Indonesia and the Philippines, and there was an attack recently near Kuala Lumpur. So how concerned is the government that Daesh is building some kind of foothold in Malaysia?
Yeah, the government is always giving it #1 priority against Daesh now, because Indonesia is close by, and we have attacks in Indonesia and in other countries. So I guess, like I said earlier, we have had such preemptive strikes. I think preemptive strike, the security apparatus in this country, it has worked quite effectively in the past. So I think continuing with the SEA Games around the corner, I think these threats are becoming, I think, not being underestimated in any way.
OK, so, of course, security concerns, because there are many countries worried about Daesh. But here's the problem. The government has extended its Controversial Security Offences Special Measures Act, also known as SOSMA, and these powers have been heavily criticised as being oppressive by human rights groups. Zurari, how much concern have these special measures attracted in Malaysia?
Okay, the problem with SOSMA is it was formulated as a way to root out terrorism and extremism, but we have seen concerns that the act itself might be, the term extremism and terrorism itself is being loosely defined. So we have people who are not exactly, as you say, being involved in extremism or terrorism, but perhaps for political reasons have been also rounded up because they are deemed as a national security concern. So that is pretty much the worry of the civil societies and human rights defenders in Malaysia.
And political leaders have been rounded up, haven't they? One opposition leader, Maria Chin, she spent 10 days in solitary confinement. She was arrested under these special measures. So people are right to be concerned, aren't they?
Yes, correct. Like you've pointed, Maria Chin, who is just an elderly woman, I mean, what sort of national threat can you expect from her? I mean, it's clear that her detention has nothing to do with terrorism and extremism. It's just that the group that she represents, per se, which is fighting for free and fair election, is absurdly being painted out as a threat to national security. So I think you can make up your mind by yourself. I mean, the sort of things that are being used under the Act.
Asman, do you agree that
yes.
SOSMA is being used by the government to stifle dissent? That was the conclusion of a US government report last month.
Yes, there's nothing new in US government reports or foreign government reports on countries like Malaysia or Asia, I mean, in facing threats. But I as a journalist, would like to leave security matters best to our security forces or security intelligence to deal with. I mean, I can only say
your security forces shouldn't be arresting political leaders or people who disagree with the government. I mean, that's not what these security special measures were intended to be used for.
Yeah, but they know best, you know. Yeah, politicians, maybe what in this country, we have categorized quite a number of issues as sensitive, and politicians tend to rile up sensitive issues. So before more damage is done, because I think they have to be,
I think most critics would argue that there is no way that any sort of special measures introduced to combat terrorism should be being directed at political opponents.
Yeah, it's quite subjective, but well, it can be argued until the cows come home. But I think in terms of security, no country would like to compromise on its security. And I think that's why Malaysia is, I would say, one of the safer countries in this region.
OK, Zurari, we know that the next elections in Malaysia have to come sometime before it's the middle of next year, isn't it? Do we know when Prime Minister Najib Razak is intending to call them?
That's a mystery. I mean, you've got us here. I mean, none of us are pretty much aware of when it is going to actually happen. I mean, we hear rumors a lot, but there is no clear or concrete indication when it is going to be held, and that is stirring anxieties around not just the public but also foreigners. I mean, to see what kind of I mean, in the future for the next few months of Malaysia, that uncertainty is there.
And how strong a position is the Prime Minister in? Because he's alleged to be involved in this massive, huge, multi-billion-dollar financial scandal, and of course these accusations that human rights aren't being respected in Malaysia. So how strong a position is he in, do you think?
Yes, you're correct. But surprisingly, it is uncertain whether the alleged scandal will actually affect when the general election is going to be held. Because as you can see, the position of Najib Razak as the Prime Minister and also the President of the ruling party UMNO is, you can say that it is quite a very strong position right now, despite all the allegations that have been thrown at him. For the past year or so, he has been consolidating his position either with the public or within the party itself. And you can see coming up to the annual General Assembly of the ruling party, even the grassroots are calling for his post to not be contested. That's how popular he is in a way right now.
If you ask me about...
Yes, go ahead, Azman. I was going to ask you how strong a position Razak's in.
If you ask me about general election, I think it will be held pretty soon. Mr. Najib is going to present to Parliament his 2018 budget or national budget in October. So I think it will be a very people-friendly budget, about the best budget that he has will be presenting. I think because and then election will be called pretty soon after that. Of course,
do you think he's got any particular rivals? I know the former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad is leading a campaign against Razak, but he's 91 years old, isn't he?
Yeah, 92 years old. But what's happening in this country now, in this election, is the opposition parties are no longer as united as before in the last two general elections, where they won very handsome seats in Parliament. I mean, depriving for the first time 2/3 majority for this ruling coalition. So now they are in this array, despite the fact that they are not together anymore. The Islamist Party PAS is no longer with the other 2 or 3 parties, as we have seen in the last 2 general elections. They did very well because they were united. So I would say the ruling government will perform well.
And very quickly, Zurari, what are Malaysian voters looking for in their next election?
I think we can expect the next general elections to be very heated because for the last general election has been very racialized. We see a lot of racial cards being played, attacks towards opposition parties, opposition leaders when it comes to racial issues. But for this next election, you can no longer count on that race card. So we can expect to see a very Islamized elections in a way. For the past year or so, you have been having a lot of religious-based arguments being brought up again and again, and it's pushing this country getting very divisive right now when it comes to religion.
Okay, guys, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed. We wait to see what happens and when this election is going to be called. Zurari R and Usman bin Ujang, thank you.
The best way to prevent drug addiction and overdose is to prevent people from abusing drugs in the first place. If they don't start, they won't have a problem. If they do start, it's awfully tough to get off. And I'm confident that by working with our healthcare and law enforcement experts, we will fight this deadly epidemic, and the United States will win.
The Trump administration is not the first to try to tackle drug addiction, but President Trump promises to be the last, insisting the United States will defeat the opioid epidemic. That would be a mammoth task. Opioids are a class of drugs which switch off pain receptors. They include prescription medication like morphine, oxycodone and fentanyl, as well as heroin. In 2015, so many opioids were prescribed, it was enough for every American to be medicated around the clock for 3 weeks. That's the finding from the president's own Commission on Combating Drug Addiction and the Opioid Crisis. It's found 142 Americans are dying each day from a drug overdose. And doctors' orders are part of the problem. The Commission's recommendation to start solving the problem is for Trump to declare a national emergency. That's something he hasn't done. Well, I'm joined now from Boston by one of the members of US President Donald Trump's Opioid Commission, Dr. Bertha Madras. She specialises in addiction biology at McLean Hospital in Massachusetts. And in Washington, we have Mike Vigil. He's a former agent with the Drug Enforcement Agency and now works on counter-narcotics programs at Mission Essential. Thank you to both of you for joining us on the program. Mike, let me start with you because you spent 30 years as a drug enforcement official. Give us the picture regarding the opioid epidemic. How is it affecting communities and families?
Well, the fact of the matter is that the opioid epidemic is probably the worst that we have ever suffered in the United States. And it's sweeping across the United States. We're looking at a multitude of pharmaceutical drugs. We're looking at illegal drugs such as heroin. And the primary issue is the prescriptions that are being given by qualified physicians here in the United States, but we also have illegal drugs that are coming from China. Some of them are coming from Mexico, and I'm talking specifically about fentanyl. And therefore, you know, it's a huge problem. You mentioned that it was a mammoth issue. I don't think that this is a problem that's going to go away, you know, in a tight, neatly wrapped package. It's going to take a long time, and it's going to take a lot of education.
Mike, you mentioned fentanyl. That's a synthetic opioid, isn't it? And those things are much stronger than other painkillers.
That is correct. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, and it's about 50 times stronger than heroin. It can be very lethal to an individual that doesn't, you know, have a lot of tolerance to that type of drug. And then there's carfentanil, which is a animal tranquilizer, and that's 1,000 times stronger than heroin. A few grains of carfentanil can be lethal to a human being.
Bertha, this is a massive problem, isn't it? Let's start with the basics. Why are these kind of painkillers being overprescribed by doctors?
It's a long story, but I'll try to go through it very quickly. In 1980, a letter to the editor was published in an esteemed journal saying that opioids given to hospitalized patients did not result in addiction, and therefore they're safe for administration. That catapulted a whole cascade of responses, including patient advocates, pain patients, pharmaceutical industries saying opioids are safe for chronic use, even though there was no evidence for their safety in chronic uses. What followed after that was that people began to pressure the Veterans Administration, pressure doctors to prescribe opioids. And then there was tremendous regulatory pressures on doctors who didn't attend to pain in their patients. By 1999,
who's to blame here? Is it the doctors? Is it the manufacturers? Is it the health industry? Who?
I think it's a sum of pain patients, doctors, pharmaceutical industry, regulatory bodies, government agencies, all of them have a role to have played in this.
And we're being told that only 1 in 4 with an opioid problem is actually being treated. That's according to the National Survey of Drug Use and Health. Bertha, why is it so low? Is this a problem of insurance, or is there simply a lack of services?
I think that lack of services, lack of insurance is a small component of it. The real problem is that there is a large majority of people who are addicted to opioids who will not seek treatment and will not, in fact, don't even think they need treatment. So that we have to identify those people above all, because they represent the lion's share of people who are running into trouble with opioids.
Mike, so obviously there's a problem here with getting people to, in the first place, seek help for their addiction, and secondly, finding them somewhere to go to treat their addiction. How do we tackle those issues?
Well, the issue is one of education. You know, you're not going to force people to seek care, obviously, but I've always been a believer of demand reduction, and I agree with the doctor. It's a combination of factors that have led to this epidemic in the United States. It's over-marketing, aggressive marketing tactics by the pharmaceutical companies, over-prescribing by the physicians, and therefore you have a bubonic plague type of epidemic that, you know, is causing 142 deaths every day in the United States. So every 3 weeks, we suffer as many casualties as we suffered in the 9/11 terrorist attack.
Yeah, the figures are quite staggering. Bertha, President Trump makes the point that he wants to make a difference in preventing addiction in the first place, as well as improving treatment for addicted people. How do we go about preventing people becoming hooked on these painkillers?
I think there are 2 prongs to that response. One is to reduce supplies. If physicians reduce the number of prescriptions for pain, if physicians reduce the doses as well as the quantity, then we would have at least supply reduction on the part of prescription opioids. And that requires a lot of increased intense education. The other part of supply is reducing the heroin fentanyl supplies that are pouring into the country. We have to remember that most of the overdoses in the most affected states now are not due to prescription opioids. They are due to heroin and fentanyl in 2016 and the early data from 2017. So that the supply has to be reduced. Then we need a national campaign to prevent substance use across the board, because it is very clear that most people who use one drug use many drugs. People are not dying simply of heroin or fentanyl or prescription opioids. They have combinations of benzodiazepines and cocaine and other drugs in them. We have to literally denormalize substance use as a way of chemical coping in our society.
Mike, there is a drug that you can take to combat the effects of an overdose, Narcan, the anti-overdose drug. Do you think that should be made more widely available and easily accessible?
Absolutely. I think that, you know, first responders and, you know, communities should have access to Narcan, which, you know, reverses opioid overdoses. And it has been very effective in a lot of communities across the United States. So the answer is absolutely yes.
And Bertha, quick last question to you.
I would like to add to that.
Yes, go on, go ahead.
Just let me add to that. The problem is that if we simply distribute Narcan without having follow-up of people who've overdosed, we're not going to solve the problem, because many people are overdosing twice, 3 times, 4 times, and finally some of them succumb with an opioid overdose. If we do not have a system in place to offer them treatment on demand or offer medications assistance and detoxification on the spot, we are not going to address the real problem, which is how to get people who are overdosing into some form of treatment.
We'll leave it there, but thank you very much indeed for joining me, Dr. Bertha Madras and Mike Vigil.
It's like a dream, a wonderful dream come true.
That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Shuli Ghosh. Next time, former Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf joins me to discuss the 70th anniversary of Pakistan and India's independence. Until then, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.